Welcome back to the wonderful world of astronomy. We are in chapter 12 on asteroids, comets, and dwarf planets. And in this video, part 4 of chapter 12, we will look at Pluto and the Kuiper belt. Here is the Kuiper belt. You've seen it before in my previous videos. It is a belt of comets that are in orbit around the sun. And it starts roughly at Neptune's orbit at about 30 astronomical units from the sun and extends out to about 100 astronomical units. And there is Pluto with its orbit with a semi-major axis of 40 astronomical units, and it is considered a Kuiper belt object. These are pictures of Pluto, first in 1930, the year it was discovered. Here's a picture of the faint dot in the sky. And then Hubble Space Telescope was able to give us better pictures. And here's a picture from Hubble in 2010. And we never had good close-up clear pictures until the New Horizons spacecraft, which launched in 2006, went on a 9-year journey, got to Pluto, and for the first time in the summer of 2015, we were able to see some amazing close-up pictures of Pluto as well as its moon Charon. Pluto has a highly inclined orbit, meaning it's not in the ecliptic plane of the other planets, it's inclined to it, and a highly elliptical orbit. So here you can see a comparison of Neptune's orbit and Pluto's orbit, and it shows that it's tilted at 17 degrees. There is an orbital resonance between Neptune and Pluto, so Neptune orbits 3 times during the time Pluto orbits twice. And here, what this is demonstrating is that Pluto's orbit between 1979 and 1999 actually brought it closer to the sun than Neptune. So in the late 70s and 80s and 90s, while Pluto was still considered a planet, while it was considered the 9th planet, the farthest out planet from the sun, during that 20-year period, it was actually closer than Neptune. And in its orbit, that is roughly 240 years, 250 years, something like that, every 20 years, it comes closer than Neptune. This is the Hubble telescope's view of Pluto and its moons. So here's Pluto and Charon, which was discovered in 1976. And then most recently, we had in about it was 2005 or 2006, these other smaller moons were discovered. Is Pluto a planet? Well, we know that it is designated as not a planet. And in an earlier video in chapter 7, I talked about the discovery of Pluto and its history in terms of us calling it a planet and not. And just to review that, when it was discovered in 1930, it was discovered based on, there was an assumption that something out there massive was pulling on Neptune's orbit. And so they did the math and they pointed their telescopes where that something massive should be, and they found Pluto. The calculations had been wrong. They just randomly happened to see Pluto up there. But they assumed originally that it was a massive planet that was pulling on Neptune. And so they named it a planet. They designated a planet, and then later on it was discovered that Pluto is not massive at all. It certainly doesn't have the mass necessary to pull on Neptune's orbit the way they thought it was doing. And so astronomers, for a while, before there was any talk of it being declassified as a planet, astronomers considered Pluto to be not really a planet. We said, yes, it is on the list of planets. It's the 9th planet, but it really acts more like a comet. We called it a Kuiper belt object. It has characteristics actually of being a very large comet in the Kuiper belt. But there didn't seem to be any need to take it off the list of planets, and so we didn't. And then starting about 2003, astronomers started to discover massive objects in the Kuiper belt that were comparable in size to Pluto. And then they started wondering, should we call these things planets? And more of them started cropping up. And eventually they decided, no, they're not planets, and neither is Pluto. So that by 2006, Pluto was no longer considered a planet. So Pluto's characteristics and what makes it not a planet. It is much smaller than the terrestrial or Jovian planets. So when it was classified as a planet, I would teach that it is by far the smallest planet. While it is on the outer solar system, it's not a gas giant like the other outer planets. It is made of ice. It has an icy composition like a comet. So it's not like a terrestrial planet either. It's more like a comet. It has a very elliptical inclined orbit, and all the other planets' orbits are not as elliptical. Mercury's an exception. It's got a fairly elliptical orbit, but they're all very well in the ecliptic plane. And Pluto comes out of the ecliptic plane like comets do. So Pluto has more in common with comets than with the 8 major planets. Its moon Charon is nearly as large as Pluto itself, and it was probably made by a major impact. Perhaps something early on in the solar system's history actually hit Pluto and blew Charon off of it, and Charon became its own separate moon. You can see in the animation down below, since it's comparable in size to Pluto, it's not a matter of Charon orbiting around Pluto, but rather the two of them orbit around their common center of mass. Pluto is very cold, so being so far in the outer solar system, 40 Kelvin, remember that's 40 degrees above absolute zero. Pluto has a thin nitrogen atmosphere that will refreeze onto the surface as Pluto's orbit takes it farther from the sun. So remember I said its orbit is something like 250 years, and it was between 1979 and 1999, pretty recently, that it was closer than Neptune to the sun. So that means it's relative to the rest of its orbit, it's near the sun, and it's got an atmosphere. And they think that when it moves farther away, it will have no atmosphere. You can think of Pluto's atmosphere. If you think of Pluto as being a comet, then the atmosphere is the coma. Here's a size comparison between the Earth, the Moon, and in between they've put Pluto and Charon. So you can see Pluto is even smaller than our Moon. The New Horizons spacecraft, while it did give us great pictures and lots of information about Pluto, we learned so much from it as it passed by. It also got good pictures of Charon. So this is the moon Charon. Here's a close-up of craters on it. Pluto's history of being a planet and then declassified as a planet is intertwined with this object called Eris. Pluto's size was overestimated, as I said before, after its discovery in 1930, and nothing of similar size was discovered for several decades. And now, since about 2003, other large objects, including Eris, have been discovered in the Kuiper belt. Now, Eris is the one that they discovered was actually larger than Pluto. And so this led to the debate, since it's larger than a planet, do we call it a planet? Does it get to be designated as a planet simply because it's larger than another planet and it's in orbit around the sun? And the other side of that debate is we really don't like calling Pluto a planet because it is rather small and for the other reasons I've given you. And so Pluto shouldn't really be considered the standard for whether we designate something a planet or not. So in the end, they declassified Pluto as a planet, and the International Astronomical Union now classifies both Pluto and Eris as dwarf planets. And among dwarf planets, here's another word, the trans-Neptunian objects. By the way, they're also called Plutoids, named after Pluto. But these are objects that, in another video, in a previous video, I said that because there isn't a clear definition of what a dwarf planet is, sometimes it's up to the individual astronomer whether they want to consider something a dwarf planet. So all of these that you see on the slide are things that astronomers have called dwarf planets. They are very large Kuiper belt objects. But here we have Pluto, Eris, Makemake, Haumea. Notice Haumea is not spherical, but an ellipsoid, and it has moons of its own. So many of these Kuiper belt objects, whether we classify them as dwarf planets or not, they have moons. And that is the end of our Part 4 video for Chapter 12 on Pluto and the Kuiper belt. Have a great day.